In my 37 years in the police force, this is probably the cruelest and most tragic murder I've had to deal with.
In October 1997, in New South Wales, a case occurred that would forever haunt the local residents. Two close friends set out on foot, with their destination being a party, but they would never make it. This case sparked an unprecedented investigation in the small town.
I said, "Who killed them?" "I killed both."
Welcome everyone, and thank you for clicking on the video. Join us as we explore cases from around the world. Some of these cases you may have heard of, while others have never been mentioned before. Now, let's dive into today's case. Lauren Margaret Barry, 14 years old, a student at Bega High School, was described as a cheerful and adventurous young girl with a deep love for the outdoors. She had many friends, one of whom was Nichole Emma Collins, 16 years old, a creative girl who adored her family. They loved camping and attending social events together. On the 6th of October, 1997, there was a long weekend in New South Wales due to a public holiday called Labor Day. The two girls, along with some friends, decided to go on a camping trip, something they had done many times before. And of course, their parents agreed. On the 3rd of October, Nichole's father set up a campsite at White Rock near Bega. The campsite was only 3 kilometers from where Lauren Barry and Nichole Collins lived. It was an ideal location, as their parents could visit them. The girls often stopped by home while camping to change clothes, shower, and eat. Nichole's father frequently visited the campsite to check on the kids. This was meant to be a fun trip for the long weekend. From all reports, the two girls had a great time with their friends. However, many of the attendees were couples, which made the two girls feel somewhat left out. Nichole had recently broken up with her boyfriend and was currently single. Being at a party surrounded by couples made her miss her ex-boyfriend. Her ex wasn't at the camping trip, he was at another party nearby. Nichole suddenly had the idea to visit the campsite where her ex-boyfriend was, and of course, she would go with her friend Lauren. The walk to the campsite wasn't far, but it was dark and dangerous at night. Yet, this was not enough to stop the young girl's plan. Around 9 p.m. on the 5th of October, Nichole, wearing her high school jacket, and Lauren left the campsite and walked toward the party. They started walking down the trail toward the Bega Road. On their way to the party, they said goodbye to some of their friends. They took a bottle of alcohol with them for the trip. Just 10 minutes later, Nichole's brother drove to the campsite to meet some friends. But he didn't see Nichole and Lauren on the road. If he had, he probably would have driven them there. Many of their friends believed the two girls would give up on their journey or return to Nichole's house. But Nichole and Lauren never did. They didn't make it to the party, nor did they return home. The next morning, people at the campsite started to wonder where they were. They were not seen at the party. Friends and family had no clues as to where the two girls could be. They might have gotten lost. They didn't call home. They had disappeared without a trace. A search was launched with great efforts made to find the girls, hoping they had simply gotten lost somewhere. But they were nowhere to be found. Panic spread throughout the community. When the police took over, everything was searched. Days went by, and there was still no sign of the girls.
My parents asked me where Lauren was, and I said, "Isn't she here? Hasn't she come home?" They headed this way in the evening. It was just over a kilometre from the campground, so I assumed that she would be there. So at that point, it was like, okay, she's not here. Something's not right, I guess. Maybe she's at Nichole's place. So I think my parents would have rung Nichole's parents to find out if the girls were there. And
then a discovery was made. A piece of clothing belonging to Lauren was found on the side of an old road. It was Lauren's shirt, the one she had been wearing when she was last seen at the campsite. There was a stain on the shirt, resembling dried blood. This was no longer just a missing person case. It was something far more dangerous. A task force was assigned to investigate. The police began to fear the worst. Multiple states were notified about the missing girls, and a special task force began to investigate anyone who might be connected to the disappearance of the two girls. Several suspects were interrogated, but they were quickly released as all had alibis. More and more names were crossed off the suspect list. Their parents appealed to the media, hoping someone would come forward, but there was no result. The only real piece of information that surfaced was a large pink television, found discarded on the side of the road. Then, it mysteriously disappeared soon after. This television would later become a key piece of evidence that would tie a suspect to the crime. Then, a police officer received a phone call. The call came from another detective who had heard about the missing girls case. The detective explained that about 3 weeks after the girls went missing, the police had searched a stolen car in Canberra. Inside the car, they found a map of the Bega area. The people who had stolen the car were arrested. He revealed the names of the two men who had been taken into custody, Leslie Camilleri and Lindsay Beckett. Leslie was a career criminal, 27 years old, with a history of violent crimes and a controlling personality. Lindsay Beckett, 23 years old and from New Zealand, also had a criminal record but was described as someone easily controlled, with a low IQ. Essentially, he did whatever Camilleri told him to. Between the two of them, they had over 220 criminal convictions, some of which were quite serious. These two men were very well known to the authorities. The task force decided to bring Lindsay Beckett in for questioning. All potential suspects needed to be ruled out, as time was of the essence. Lindsay was interrogated. He claimed that on the night the girls went missing, he and his friend Camilleri had gone to a music festival, and he knew nothing about the girls other than what he had read in the newspapers. One of the detectives decided to take a different approach. He mentioned the pink television and asked Beckett if he knew anything about it. Up until that moment, Lindsay Beckett had been calm, as though he was just casually talking with the police. But the moment the pink television was mentioned, his tone changed. The detectives noticed he seemed more tense. It was almost as if he knew the police were onto him. The detectives suspected that the pink television might actually be part of the case, but they had no concrete proof. He was allowed to go, but the suspicion surrounding him was far from over, and he was still under close watch. The investigators began looking into the origins of the television. These two men were known for being involved in drug dealings, and, according to investigative sources, in one of their drug transactions, the payment for the deal had been a television. Leslie Camilleri was then brought in for questioning. He had been detained for several thefts he had committed. He was the smarter of the two men, and the police quickly learned that Beckett was essentially Camilleri's lackey, someone who would do anything he was told. During his interrogation, Leslie told the same story as Lindsay, claiming he knew nothing about the missing girls, only what he had read in the newspapers. Then they asked him about the pink television and whether he had been driving a car with a television on the day the girls went missing. Camilleri panicked and then refused to speak to the police. Furthermore, he was taken back to his cell. This was the moment investigators believed they had caught the perpetrator. Camilleri no longer wanted to talk. The police received a phone call. The call came from the prison where Leslie Camilleri was being held. They informed the investigators working on the case that Leslie Camilleri was in his cell, showing signs of anxiety and distress. He was banging his head against the wall and kept mumbling something about a broken television. The investigators then turned their attention to the less intelligent one, Beckett. One of the detectives brought a photo of the missing girl. When he showed it to Beckett, Beckett couldn't even look at it. Then he uttered a horrifying sentence to the investigators. "I'll show you where we hid the bodies."
Can you recall the television being in the back seat at all at that time? Can you recall getting rid of
those bags and stuff like that?
Can you recall getting rid of the television at any time during that trip?
No.
Convinced the television may be the clue that could unlock the case,
We met Mr. Beckett and had quite a long conversation with him. He was the most relaxed person I've ever met. He actually had his feet up on the chair in the interview room, as if he just didn't care. I held back the question about the television till quite near the end, and you could sense there was a change in his demeanour. He was obviously a bit uncomfortable when that came up and didn't have a good answer. Can you recall the television being in the back seat at all at that time? Can you recall getting rid of this?
He agreed to ride with the investigators and led them to the exact location where the two men had murdered Lauren and Nichole, along with the site where the murder weapon was disposed of. The bodies of Lauren Barry and Nichole Collins were found in a remote area of the bushland, near Fiddler's Green Creek, on the border between New South Wales and Victoria. This location was hundreds of kilometers from where they were last seen. No one could have mapped out such a vast search area. Lauren and Nichole's bodies were taken to a forensic laboratory for autopsies. Both men were arrested and charged with murder. Beckett confessed, but Camilleri denied responsibility, attempting to downplay his role by blaming everything on Lindsay Beckett. Investigators were able to piece together what had happened that night. Around 9 p.m. on the 5th of October, Camilleri and Beckett were driving a Ford Telstar that belonged to Camilleri's partner. Earlier that day, Camilleri had argued with his partner and had been talking to Beckett about feeling depressed. The two men had been drinking beer and injecting each other with methamphetamine and heroin while aimlessly driving around. According to Beckett, Camilleri spotted the girls walking single file along Bega Road at Evan Hill and pulled over to offer them a ride. Around 10 p.m., after a brief discussion, the girls voluntarily got into the car. A pink portable television, which Camilleri and Beckett had previously taken from a friend in exchange for a drug debt, was removed from the back seat and discarded by the roadside to make room for the girls to sit. Beckett told the police that the group went to Tathra Beach and stayed there for a while before heading back to the White Rock campsite. On the way to the campsite, Camilleri became agitated when the car hit the ground on the rough gravel road, and he grew angry at the girls. The car's rear doors had been locked earlier using the vehicle's child lock system, and the windows couldn't be rolled down, preventing the passengers from opening the doors. Camilleri pulled out a knife and told the girls they would be stabbed if they tried to escape. Beckett also pulled out a knife and joined Camilleri in threatening the girls. While driving, Camilleri reached for a knife stored in the driver's side door pocket. It was a black-handled pocket knife with a serrated blade. Camilleri turned toward the girls and showed them the knife, ordering them to stay quiet and not say anything. Camilleri said that if they didn't do as he instructed, he would stab them. At that moment, Camilleri told me to take out my knife. I took my knife from the glove compartment. I had a black-handled knife with a serrated blade. I showed the girls that I had a knife too. I told them to follow Camilleri's instructions. Camilleri then backed the car out of the campsite and drove on to Old Wallagoot Road. Instead of being returned to the campsite as promised, the girls were taken to a dump site on Old Wallagoot Road, not far from their homes in Kalaru, where they were both sexually assaulted. The girls were then transported further south, passing through the town of Marambula, until the car stopped at Bega National Park, where the assaults continued. A black rubber torch belonging to Barry and a sanitary pad were later found at the scene by the police. The group continued traveling through the town of Eden, where the men assaulted the girls again in a secluded area south of town. Camilleri then ordered Beckett to drive. Beckett drove toward Orbost before taking a turn and finally stopping at Wingan Point in Victoria, where the girls were assaulted once more. Camilleri fell asleep but later woke up and realized where he was. Beckett recalled this in his statement to the police. I was driving along the highway, and just before Can River, Les woke up. He wanted to know where we were. I told him that we were in Victoria, on our way to Orbost. Les started cursing and insulting me. He said he wanted to go to Sydney. He kept saying, the bridge. I understood that this meant he wanted to throw the girls off a bridge because he had talked about this before. There are several bridges on the way to Sydney along the Hume Highway with steep drops. The girls began questioning the men, asking if they were going to be killed. Camilleri assured them that they would only be tied up so the men could escape. During this time, Beckett recalled that Camilleri repeatedly said, "They can't go back," implying his intent to kill the girls to avoid being caught for their crimes. The final stop, at around 8 a.m. the next morning, was at Fiddler's Green Creek, just south of the Victoria-New South Wales border. The girls' hands were tied, and they were ordered to walk along a secluded bush trail through rough terrain towards the creek. After walking along the creek for several hundred meters, Camilleri ordered the girls to undress and wash themselves thoroughly to remove any evidence of the previous assaults. They were then ordered to lie face down before being tied up and gagged. The girls were separated by approximately 30 meters, 98 feet, while Camilleri and Beckett discussed what to do next. Camilleri demanded that Beckett drown the girls, but Beckett objected, saying it wasn't fair that he had to kill both of them. Eventually, Beckett complied after an argument broke out, and Camilleri threatened to stab him if he refused. Beckett first attempted to drown Barry, who was tied near the creek. After a struggle, he became frustrated when his knee got wet. He grabbed his knife and slashed Barry's throat, accidentally cutting his own thumb in the process. Beckett described the scene to the police as follows. I walked over to Lauren and pulled her into the water. I held her head underwater. She struggled and managed to push me into the water. One of my knees, I think it was my left knee, fell into the water. This made me a bit angry, and I opened my knife, which was in my left hand, and I stabbed Lauren on the left side of her neck. I had said in my interview that it was the right side of her neck with my right hand, but I've thought about it since then. It wasn't my right thumb that got cut, it was my left thumb. A few seconds after I stabbed her, she stopped moving. Beckett then ran up the embankment toward Collins, who was tied to a tree and out of Barry's view, as Barry lay dying in the creek. Beckett slashed Collins's throat multiple times before he began punching and kicking her when he realized she had not died immediately from the stab wounds. After the murders, Camilleri, who had not been present at the killings and had been waiting in the car, asked Beckett, "Did you see the demon?" The pair quickly left the crime scene, with Beckett driving back to New South Wales. Camilleri drove away from the murder site while Beckett slept in the car, waking up as they neared Canberra. They stopped at Theodore Lookout on the Monaro Highway and burned the blood-stained clothes, ropes, and gags used to restrain the girls. The pair then threw the knives from Commonwealth Avenue Bridge into Lake Burley Griffin before returning to their home in Yass. On the 8th of October 1997, Camilleri and Beckett drove to Sydney and stayed with Camilleri's brother for a few days. While in Campbelltown in southwestern Sydney, they spent 6 hours cleaning the car at a car wash, even removing the seats and carpets for a thorough scrub. They later returned to Canberra to destroy more evidence before heading back to Bega to retrieve the discarded portable television that Camilleri feared could link them to the crime, but their search was unsuccessful. The television had already been handed over to the police. Through intelligence work, investigators discovered that the television had been sold to someone at a second-hand store and later given to the killers as a form of payment. The serial number on the television matched records that linked it to the perpetrators. More evidence connected them to the crime. At that time, Camilleri was already in custody at Goulburn Correctional Center for breaching bail conditions and was awaiting trial. He was interrogated again by police and informed of Beckett's confession. Camilleri once again denied any involvement in the murders, portraying Beckett as the sole killer. He claimed he had been in a drug-induced stupor for most of the time the girls were in the car, stating, "We picked up the girls and went to the beach. I injected heroin behind the shed. While the girls were drinking, I tried to overdose. We drove around with the girls. I was asleep most of the time." Beckett later told me that he had dropped both girls off at home. "I remember waking up and seeing the girl. We parked the car in the bushes. I asked Beckett where we were and he said Victoria, somewhere on the main road. I went mad. I told him to go home, to get out of here immediately. Then I saw him coming out of the bushes. He had blood all over him. He told me he had cut his finger." Later, police charged Camilleri and Beckett with multiple counts of kidnapping, rape, and murder. On the 26th of June, 1998, Lindsay Beckett stood trial at the Supreme Court of Victoria. Fortunately, he pleaded guilty to the murders of Lauren Barry and Nichole Collins. He was sentenced to life imprisonment with a non-parole period of 35 years. At the time, this was the longest non-parole period ever imposed in Victoria. Camilleri went to trial in February 1999 and pleaded not guilty. A total of 70 witnesses were called to testify. The prosecution's evidence included a shirt belonging to Barry that contained semen matching Camilleri's DNA. The shirt was found at a dump site on Old Wallagoot Road, where the pair had first abducted the girls. Police gathered evidence from nearly every location where the girls had been taken and assaulted. Beckett was called to testify against his accomplice and spent 5 days on the witness stand. Camilleri continued to claim that he had been in a drug-induced stupor while the girls were with them in the car and that he barely remembered them, hoping to shift full responsibility for the murders onto Beckett. On the 10th of April 1999, he was found guilty. Camilleri was sentenced to life imprisonment without the possibility of parolia, just but rare sentence in Australia. Tragically, this was not where the story ended. In 2012, Camilleri confessed to murdering another woman. Prudence Bird was a 13-year-old girl living in Victoria. Born on the 26th of March, 1978, she was described as a typical teenager who was close to her family and enjoyed life. However, on the 2nd of February 1992, she vanished from her home. Her disappearance remained a mystery for 20 years. Then, in 2012, Leslie Camilleri confessed to the murder. There were inconsistencies in his story. Possibly due to the passage of time, or perhaps others were involved. Tragically, Prudence's body was never found. For this murder, Camilleri was convicted and sentenced to an additional 28 years added to his life sentence. I hope he spends the rest of his life in prison, repenting for the horrors he has committed.